Hello everyone, welcome to Bowie's Piano Man. Well, my name is John Brereton, I'm the venue manager here, and I suppose I better confess I'm a Bowie Isle. As my love affair, and as my wife will testify, it definitely is an affair. Began probably when I was 15, about 1980, and the first in that time-honoured Irish tradition of like your first initiation into drinking. I bought a 6-pack of Carlsberg, I remember. Got someone a few years older to go in off licence and buy the drink for me, and I was all set to go to the fields. It was Halloween night, of course, traditional night to start your boozing career. And on the way home, I dropped into a friend's house just to arrange the festivities, and he was playing his sister's album, Hunky Dory, and I was just transfixed. So I ended up swapping the 6-pack for the album, and anyway, that began my since lifelong love affair with Bowie. I'm sure everyone here has a similar story, but I'd just like to tell you how this gig came about. The venue here has a kind of strong association with Bowie over the years. We have a band, Rebel Rebel, and Peter from Rebel Rebel is going to sing a few songs. They played here a few times, always 350 packed house. They're an amazing band. And Warner Brothers have done a few Bowie launches here. They launched their Bowie Is movie here recently, and so we're very happy to be hosting this event tonight as part of Music Town. I suppose the way it happened was the owner of the venue, Brian Montague, told me one day at the end of last year that a friend of his had written a book about Bowie's piano man, Mike Garson. And so obviously my ears pricked up and was like, that's amazing. And so I was dying to meet him just to get any juicy insider gossip to what it was like. But Clifford, I rang him, and we were talking about Mike actually coming to Dublin, which is in process, probably going to happen maybe at the end of the year sometime. I don't know where, we're looking at Vicar Street or the National Concert Hall for that gig. But in the meantime, when talking to Clifford and talking to Clifford and Clifford talking, it dawned on me that actually a really nice event could be Clifford to come over and chat about the book and do interspersed with a few songs. And lo and behold, the Music Town Festival, which is now on, it's in its first year, was happening around this time, and their theme is collaboration, so I thought that could be perfect. So I contacted them, and Karen Walsh said it sounds like a lovely night. So anyway, it's all happening, and hopefully it's going to be a great night. So thanks for coming, and I'd like to introduce you to Clifford Slapper. Roisin Dwyer from Hot Press is going to do the Q&A. It's Roisin. But first, we have a little message from Mike, who sadly couldn't be with us today.
So now you know my great secret. I have a confession. After 40 years, I never played the parts of Lady Grinning Soul or Time. This magic piano has done it. I may believe I was playing it. Well, I'm sorry I can't be with you there in London today, but I'm busy here in California, and it's still a pleasure to be with you. Probably there shouldn't be a biography at this part of my life on me, because there's probably another volume sitting back there. But since Cliff got this wonderful deal with the publishing company Phantom, I think it's great that this is happening at this point in time. Cliff and I met several years back. As you know, he's a very good pianist, and he actually had worked with David Bowie on, with Ricky Gervais on that commercial funny thing that happened years ago. I forget the name of it, but he came to the States and we hit it off, and he just got the urge after we spoke, and so did I, to do a biography on my life, and we spent about 25 hours where he interviewed me, and then subsequently probably another 200 hours, aside from the 30 or 40 people he interviewed and all the other information that he gathered. So probably be a very boring book for a lot of people. It has no gossip in it, and you'd have to get that into some other books. I'm purposely withholding any dirt that I have from those periods in the 70s, and you're just going to get all about the music and the art and pretty much the creative process. So I'm sorry about that. I know people like a little about that, but that's not where I live. I'm really hoping this is an inspiration to future artists and creators that come about over the next several hundred years, because I think you can actually have a balanced life, do your music and have a family, etc., and you don't have to be insane and crazy and dramatizing all kinds of things to do music. So those are some of my thoughts there. I don't think I have much to say other than I think I should play live for you. I've been working on a little arrangement of Space Oddity. I always change it around because that's not a tune that I recorded on the original version, but I recorded it on a solo album of the Bowie variations, but I'm still searching and finding new things on that piece. So I'm going to use that famous lick that goes I'm going to use that as kind of a, let's say, a motif to develop and fool around with, but you'll see how it develops. I mean, I don't even know, because I play it differently each time, and I was working on something the other day, but it had a different energy, so we'll see where it goes today. And I really want to thank you for coming to this event, and hope you do enjoy the book, and let me know when, write me on Facebook or whatever. And I want to thank Cliff. This guy was working 16 hours a day the last 6 months. I could not believe it. So I think you're really going to get an honest book, and enjoy it.
Pleasure.
That was absolutely wonderful. Well, firstly, I want to say congratulations to Clifford on his amazing book, which I recommend everyone leaves here with a copy of under their arm. But Clifford, maybe first tell us how this book came about, and as a player yourself, what influence Bowie and Mike had on your musical career.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the congratulations and the recommendation. This book was absolutely a labour of love. I've worked solidly on it for the last few years and enjoyed every moment. And the story begins a long time ago because I was 6 years old when my parents bought me a toy piano, and apparently that was the toy that I was never off, so they therefore sent me for piano lessons. And they looked up in what used to be called the Yellow Pages. This was long before the days of Google. And I found in the Yellow Pages a local teacher by the name of Miss Beryl Silly. Slightly implausible name, but it's absolutely true, and all the funnier for the fact that my name is Slapper. And so the rest of the family felt slightly left out, so my mother and father and brother and sister actually all went along for lessons to Miss Silly as well. She was actually had the 5 slappers in per week. And one by one they dropped out. It was a little bit like, you know, the 10 green bottles on the wall. They dropped out and I was the only one left. And I went for these lessons with this little old lady, Miss Silly, with her very screeching parakeet next to the piano, and she was really eccentric. And it was all a bit weird. Then my grandmother, who was taking me to the lessons, bought me a cassette tape album, which was Honky Chateau by Elton John. So called because it was recorded in Paris at the Chateau d'Hérouville, which is where Bowie later recorded pin-ups. And that slightly opened my mind because it had some beautiful songs and a lot of very different piano from what I was learning. Then a year or two later, I got into David Bowie, and that's where the story really starts, because the first album I ever bought for myself was Aladdin Sane, and this was just at the beginning of the whole sort of glam rock thing and so on, and it was just a revelation, because on that album was this crazy piano, which turned out to be Mike Garson's, and it had a very angular, sharp sound like breaking glass, shattering all over it. It really was extraordinary, and I remember to this day how the impact that had on me. And I think it was because I just thought, wow, you know, playing the piano can be cool, and there's some more than just going to these old classical lessons each week. And I think from that day onwards was the influence that I wanted to become a pianist like that. So there is quite a romantic circularity to the story, because I really didn't know that not just years but decades later I would actually briefly work with David Bowie and then become very good friends with Mike Garson and be asked by him to write his life story. And tell us about working with Bowie. Well, that's kind of slightly peripheral to tonight, but I suppose it is interesting, and it is indirectly relevant. But I was called in to play the piano, which Bowie mimed to on his comedy appearance on Ricky Gervais's Extras. So we had if you've seen Extras with Ricky Gervais, he's playing the piano and singing the Pug-Nosed Face song to the character played by Ricky Gervais. And we had a second piano hidden off camera, which I was playing, and he was miming to my playing. A couple of years later, and that was a really big excitement for me. It was an absolute joy. They say you should never meet your heroes because you'll be disappointed, and this was certainly not the case. He was an absolute gentleman, very modest and great to work with, and really an absolute dream. And then a couple of years later I got the chance to meet Mike Garson, his long-term pianist, and the strangest coincidence happened. Before I could even bring this up, Mike Garson said that at home in LA he was watching, you know, on cable TV, and he said, I saw this English comedy program with David playing the piano. So I spoke to David and said, it looks like you won't be needing me as your pianist anymore, because, you know, Mike was joking with him, and said, you know, you were playing the piano on that comedy show. And apparently David Bowie replied, no, that wasn't me, that was some English guy. So Mike actually told me that story as a little joke about what had happened between him and David. And I had the wonderful opportunity to interrupt and say, actually, I was that guy. So there was kind of a bit of a really freak coincidence at that moment, which we sort of bonded over. And we ended up chatting for hours about everything under the sun, and I just sprung it on him, and I said, you seem to have had a fascinating life. Has anyone ever written your biography? Because there are loads of biographies of Bowie, but none of his most frequent musician. So Mike said, no one's ever written one, but I think you seem to be the perfect person to do it. I guess he'd picked up on my enthusiasm, so there it is.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a beautifully written book and full of amazing stories. But the first one that's most striking is the story of how Mike goes one moment from being a struggling jazz musician to the next moment getting this amazingly fortuitous phone call from David Bowie's manager. Tell us that story.
He was a struggling jazz musician playing in the smoky underground jazz bars in New York, earning virtually no money, which of course is still the case for a lot of jazz gigs, as musicians will tell you. And he had a baby of 1 year old at home. He's from Brooklyn, and you know, and in New York, he was playing in these clubs. And he came home that night. He remembers clearly taking home $5 one night as his share of the door or whatever, and said to his wife, "I can't go on. I've got to find something else to do." And he was sort of on the verge of not exactly giving up music, but rethinking it. The very next day, apparently, he had this mystery call from a certain Tony DeFries, David Bowie's manager at the time, saying, "We've been recommended to you by somebody in New York. We've just arrived in America, the Ziggy Stardust tour. We're about to take America by storm, but David wants to have this extra ingredient of avant-garde piano." It was quite a conscious thing, and I think it shows the artistic genius, perhaps, of David Bowie. How many rock stars at that time were adding that kind of weird ingredient into their instrumentation? Not many. So Mike's reaction to this invitation was initially to say, "David who?" He had no idea what this was about, but the bizarre thing is that, as you say, within a week he was actually doing an entire tour of a national tour of the States, which went on to be a world tour. Went to Japan, went to Europe, and ended up playing at what was then Hammersmith Odeon on the final date of the Ziggy Stardust experience.
Yeah, and you describe beautifully the first audition, or his baptism of fire, where he goes in and, you know, he plays Changes. But I think it was apparent to Mick Ronson and the entire, like, he was taken on board very quickly. He was in very fast. So just describe, as a piano player, like the process and how Mike impressed and found his way into the band.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the time, Changes was a beautiful song that was on the Hunky Dory album, which was already out. And Mike definitely says there's no way he would have heard that at that point. He left behind he had his baby there, and he was giving the piano lesson. And he still, I think, feels bad about the fact that he was told if he wants the job, he's got to rush to the audition studio in Manhattan, 20 minutes away. And they wanted him right then and there. You know, Tony DeFries was a demanding man. So he actually asked his piano student to look after the baby, and I think he said his wife still hasn't forgiven him for that faux pas. But he literally just ran across town, and when he got there were these spiders from Mars, as they were called, and for some unknown reason they were all in their stage garb, and he describes it vividly that they were, you know, he says first there was this guy with long silver sideburns, which aficionados of the glam rock scene will know as Trevor Bolder. And there was another guy with sort of knee-high red boots, and he describes all this. Even today, Mike is a kind of, as you've just seen, he's a fairly sort of unreconstructed, down-to-earth Brooklyn kind of guy. So he's never quite, you know, been part of that image side of things particularly, and so he was just bewildered. And what am I doing here? So what happened, and to come to your point about the musical side of it, was that Mick Ronson passed him a scrap of paper and said, "Look, these are the chords to a song that we do called Changes. Could you just play your way through them?" And I could actually demonstrate this because the chords themselves were quite straightforward. At that time, some of us know this song Changes to be quite jazzy. That's because Mike has played on it live hundreds of times, and we know that. But the original album version was played by Rick Wakeman, and it was played fairly straight. So you have these chords. Really quite simple chords, but Mike, of course, was a jazz pianist, so he would have done something. And he hadn't got nearly as far as that, apparently, when Mick Ronson just said, "You're in."
And like his work on Aladdin Sane is always described as groundbreaking. Like, as a fellow musician, why do you think it is always hailed as such?
He just did what he knew best, which was being himself, being open-minded, improvising, not following any boundaries, and that comes across in the album. There are some tracks where his piano is completely avant-garde, such as on the title track. And then on the final track, A Lady Grinning Soul, it's not really. It's from the romantic classical tradition, and it could be a piece by Liszt, which is his favourite classical composer. So it's all there, the classical and the jazz influences. He just did his thing.
I think we're going to have a song now, actually. So I'd like to invite up onto the stage Mr. Peter Quinn, lead singer with Rebel Rebel, to sing Changes.
To talk about Mick Ronson for a minute, because obviously Mick was playing a lot of piano before Mike came on the scene, so it sort of relieved his load a little. But they went on to have quite an extensive working relationship, because as well as working together with Bowie, Mike played on a lot of Mick's solo work. What was their creative relationship like?
That's a really good point, well worth bringing up, because Mick Ronson is another very underrated talent. And he was Bowie's guitarist throughout this period, and as you say, before Garson came along, he was doubling up as pianist for a lot of the time. There were a few other pianists on board, as I've mentioned, Rick Wakeman already, but a lot of the piano, for example, on Ziggy Stardust was done by Mick Ronson specifically. And he also ended up, just by default, doing a lot of the orchestral strings arrangements. In fact, Mick Ronson, it's fair to say, was a bit of a musical genius. And but he was relieved to have this even better pianist come along and take the pressure off around the time of Aladdin Sane. And as you say, Mick Ronson left the Bowie fold not terribly long after that, and went on to produce in particular two very good solo albums later in the 70s, both of which feature none other than Mike Garson very heavily on piano. And I think anyone who's interested in this stuff and who's enjoyed hearing Mike Garson on some of the songs we're talking about would do very well to look up Mick Ronson's solo albums and just have a good listen, because they're really amazing and really underrated.
And there's a brilliant line from Bowie in the book where he says, you know, Mike Garson is the best rock pianist in the world because he doesn't play any rock. Would you like to explain that for us?
It was partly Bowie was almost indirectly giving a compliment to himself in a way, because it was he who actually brought, as I said earlier, he was directing what was essentially rock music in that genre of pop music. And he made a conscious decision to bring in elements of avant-garde jazz. That's the simple fact of the matter. And I suppose what he's saying, though, is that Mike Garson is a wonderfully spontaneous, creative improviser. He mentioned on the message earlier that he never plays the same thing the same way twice, which makes him a bit of a producer's nightmare, incidentally, because when you're in a recording studio, that's exactly what you do need somebody to repeat what they've done earlier sometimes. But Mike's very spontaneous. He really does practice what he preaches in terms of living in the moment. And I think that's what Bowie meant, that he's a bit of an untamed beast, because he will ultimately just do his thing. And that, of course, that in itself is quite rock and roll, so it fits well.
And you did so much research for this book. It's very rich and such a fascinating read. And you also conducted hours and hours of interviews, and some of them were spent in the company of Mr. Tony Visconti, who there's a brilliant line from him when he says, you know, I was so familiar with Mike from his avant-garde style, and for young Americans, he just sort of morphed into this funk player. And he was totally impressed with Mike. Are you, is that clear to you from, as a musician, he has this ability to reinvent himself? And also, what was it like talking to Tony Visconti?
Well, taking the points, in reverse order, Tony Visconti is a remarkable man. And in fact, I looked up, I knew that he'd produced a lot of Bowie albums, and that's why I was interviewing him, and I knew he'd worked with Mike a few times. But at the time I interviewed him, I just looked up, a list of all the albums that Tony Visconti has produced, and it's absolutely extraordinary, because it goes, over a period of about 50 years. It's basically the soundtrack to our lives, to coin a cliche, and he wasn't just Bowie. He's produced albums by T-Rex, Morrissey, the Moody Blues, Thin Lizzy, all kinds of different bands. So he was fascinating to speak to, and he speaks very, very highly of Mike, as indeed everyone did. It was really hard, actually, and I've said this in the book at one point, that I didn't want the book to come across as being just purely a sort of paean to this musician. I wanted it to have some critical elements, but it was genuinely hard, because it's very much based on interviewing people who've worked with him. And it was very hard to find anyone who'd say a bad word against him. But when it came to Tony Visconti, in a very jokey way, he did actually say this, that Mike is fascinating to work with, and they loved his musical genius, his adaptability, as you say, playing soul music, or when they needed him to do so, they could send him away with a classical reference. As on some of the later work, especially in the 90s, Bowie would actually give him little pointers to go and listen to. And Mike has actually told me that he would always be polite and go away and listen to them, and maybe they would influence him, but even then, he would still do what he felt was right. And Tony Visconti, there's a great quote from him, actually, in the book, where he says, if you speak to Mike about what you need from him on a particular recording, he'll just look at you with those deep green eyes and keep nodding his head and agree with you, and then he'll go away and do whatever the fuck he wants. And that was Tony Visconti's verdict on Mike.
Yeah, and I mean Mike's adaptability is, very apparent in looking at the amount of the diverse talent that he's worked with and people that have invited him to come on board and work with them, like Billy Corgan and Trent Reznor, wouldn't be people who you would immediately think of. So tell us a bit about those collaborations.
Well, just trying to keep it fairly brief, Trent Reznor went on tour with Bowie in '95. When Bowie did his Outside tour, he wanted to make it a joint tour with Nine Inch Nails. And that's what happened, and so therefore Trent was hearing Mike's playing and really fell for it. And he actually says that even in the rehearsal stage, you know, when you would just hear this extraordinary sound coming from the piano, and then he would look, and there'd be this these piercing eyes, actually just looking right in front of him, not even looking at the piano. So he really seemed to be from another world, and Trent Reznor was really convinced that he wanted to use him on a future album, and did. And it's exactly the same really with Billy Corgan. They were doing a French TV show around the same period, and just encountered Mike there and heard him playing. And actually these musicians and many others besides, all of them have got extraordinary respect for Mike Garson. I actually had put out the feelers to see if I can get interviews with a lot of these people, and I was astonished, you know, bearing in mind that Trent Reznor is certainly in a lot of people's eyes, you know, quite the rock god, and yet he phoned me at home one night, just out of the blue, and he said, I've got hold of your number, I've heard that you're writing this book about Mike, and I have to be involved, I have to help, because Mike's such a great guy. He stayed on the phone to me that night for an hour or two. I couldn't get rid of the bugger, and he was doing the tour of the States at the time, you know, Nine Inch Nails, and he only actually rang off and we were able to wind down the conversation because he was being called to sound check. And I only say that because he's a fantastic guy, and really to have people like that who were insistent that they had to give their information about Mike really told me a lot about the relationship that Mike has developed with these people.
Yeah. And I mean, he obviously he started out as a struggling jazz musician and then was sort of wrenched out of that world into a rock and pop zone. So, like, how did that background serve him, and how did it inform his work and Bowie's albums?
Well, in lots of ways, but I would say the main way is what I touched on earlier, which is improvisation. You know, his jazz background really had left him with this idea that each moment you're creating something new. You know that the sort of standard the standard form of jazz incorporates the idea of an improvised solo, which a lot of other musical forms don't necessarily do as much. And so Mike's really, his trademark now, Mike's trademark is improvisation. I'd say that's what he brings.
I'd like to rewind a little bit to 1971, and for another song, we're going to welcome up on stage a guy who released a very critically acclaimed album last year called Vigil, and his name is Johnny Rage.
Pete, you're tall. It's an honour to be asked over here to play this song with Clifford. Thanks a lot, John.
I smiled sadly, out of law I could not obey.
We were talking just briefly there about improvisation, and one album which Mike's background would have stood him was outside the Bowie Eno collaboration, which obviously the ability to improvise was a requirement on that recording session.
Sure. I mean, the Bowie album in the mid-90s, Outside, it was actually called One Dot Outside because it was initially meant to be part of a trilogy or possibly even more. And that got abandoned, so it was just left to the number one. That was one of Bowie's most experimental albums, and it was actually the way the songs were created was quite improvisational, and they were built up in layers. And there were some very experimental things going on. It was very much an art album, even more than Bowie's early albums, in fact. And apparently he was there with an easel sketching the musicians as they played, not just for fun, but as part of the process. And Brian Eno does some very odd things, which some of you may be aware of as a producer. He gives out sort of secret roles to all the musicians, a bit like psychodrama, that they have to play within that role, and the others don't know what role they're following, and they're given secret cards. All these weird games. So it sounds like it was quite an experience. And Mike just took it in his stride because he clearly was from quite an experimental background himself.
And on Earthling, I mean, one of his most best regarded piano solos is the solo on 7 Years in Tibet. And it's explained in the book that Bowie had a very clear vision of what he wanted that solo to be. Is that a rare example of Bowie being a dictator, or how did their working relationship evolve? Like, was it mostly Bowie giving direction, or Mike doing his own thing? Like, what would you say? Was it 50-50?
Kind of, yeah. I think from everything I've heard, which is a lot from Mike Garson, these two men have had over a period of decades a really good working creative relationship. It really does work. And if you look at the book, you'll see there are quotations from each of them about the other, which are really singing their praises. And so basically, Bowie, like Tony Visconti, admires Mike's creativity and ability to improvise and to just adapt into different styles. I mean, he's a consummate accompanist in a sense, because he can feel sensitively what's needed. And so he's a great collaborator in that sense, even though at the same time he does his own thing as well, if that makes sense. He's somewhere in between the two. But Mike's comments about David Bowie are that he brings out the best in him, because he says of all the producers he's worked with, Bowie as a producer gives him just enough freedom to actually express himself and be himself. Now, you're quite right, there are some songs which, as documented, there were definitely some kind of instructions and guidance for sure. Bowie certainly knows what he wants. With that particular song, 7 Years in Tibet, after that, it was a sort of Farfisa organ solo on that, and after that had been played back, Bowie actually told Garson that it was the best solo he'd ever done, even better than Aladdin Sane. So that somehow they have this kind of synchronicity between them.
And like, through all the hours of interviews and all the research you did, what are the key insights you took away from your book into David Bowie's creative process?
Oh, it's that's a hard question, because there was so much there. I mean, I learnt a lot from writing this book, not just about Mike or about David Bowie, but really, if it doesn't sound too cliched, about life itself, because this whole idea of sort of living in the moment or working in the moment is a hugely popular cliche in recent years. But I think through studying the work of this man, it's taken on a much more concrete meaning for me. It actually has quite a genuine sort of relevance to my life and to the creative process. As for what I learnt about David Bowie, and I suppose it's the point I just touched on, that part of Bowie's genius is he constantly has refined his palette of colours as an artist. And there are plenty of disgruntled musicians, some of whom I've met, who have been dropped by Bowie over the years. And it has sometimes seemed incredibly harsh, but I think that in Bowie's defence, that's the job of a sort of a lead artist. To him, these are the colours on his painting board, and he's been a bit ruthless over the years in deciding what's needed at any given time.
Sure. And one of the interesting sections as well, interesting to Irish people, is the section on Jerry Leonard, our own Jerry Leonard from Clontarf. Bowie's musical director, and he sort of seems to have had a very different vision to Mike, in that, like, at one point, you know, he says to Mike, "Don't just be improvising over Bowie songs, Mike." Was there a clash of creative vision there, or what was their working relationship like?
Jerry Leonard's a great guy, and he actually gave me a very long interview for this book, and it's all documented there, and we're still in touch. He's a lovely guy, and he has a very good relationship with Mike to this day. They really get on. What happened is that when Jerry was becoming musical director for Bowie in the early 2000s, he knew that he was a difficult task on his hands, because they were planning, you know, a huge tour with a lot of back catalogue songs, and he saw it as his job to actually mastermind this on behalf of Bowie. That's exactly what he did, and he did it very, very well indeed, actually, to manage the whole process. So he actually scheduled in a long phone call with Mike. No phone call to Mike is short. He's quite the talker, as am I. And so this was a 2 or 3 hour phone call between Jerry and Mike, in which you're quite right, he did say, look, you can't just improvise. Like, they had to set certain boundaries. But because he was Mike told me this, that because Jerry was very blunt and direct in saying what was needed and really putting the cards on the table, after that they actually got on like a house on fire. And in fact, Mike turned around and said to him, look, you know that I give a hard life to other directors and producers, but he actually said, with you I won't, because you've been really straight with me, and you said that, you know, you've got your eyes on me, and you need me to sort of do certain things. And he probably still did his own thing, but they established a very good relationship from that.
Yeah. And a few years ago, Mike released Bowie's Variations for Piano. Can you tell us a bit about that project? And do you think that was something he wanted to get out of his system, or why did he decide to go down that road?
I think there were several reasons. This was an album that Mike did on his own in 2011. At that time, he hadn't played with Bowie for 5 years. And maybe he missed some of those songs, but I don't know. But it's just a piano interpretation of a number of Bowie songs, and it's very beautiful, and it's very experimental, and it's certainly got the thumbs up from David Bowie, and it's unusual. And of course, most of those songs that he chose to explore purely with the piano, we heard him doing it with Space Oddity. It is quite an experimental angle, and some of them are quite heavily disguised as a result. It's quite, you know, enjoyable for the Bowie fans to spot what song he's doing. Most of the songs he chose on his own album were not ones that he had originally worked on. He didn't record on the original versions of pretty much all of those, although he had played some of them live. And they're quite unusual choices for him to play with on the piano. So it's a fascinating document. And as I say, it certainly seems to have had the thumbs up from the man himself.
And in addition to writing this fantastic tome, what else have you been doing, Clifford? What about your own work?
Well, I've carried on playing music, which I love. I see the two, hopefully, as quite integrated. I would not have written this book if it weren't for a passion that I have for David Bowie and for Mike Garson, and actually wanting more people to know about Mike, because he's an exceptional man. There won't be time perhaps tonight to explore all aspects of this, but the book does have chapters on other parts of his life and other parts of his work, including the classical and the jazz, and he's got a huge involvement at the moment in music as therapy. It's a whole new chapter in his life. We've explored all sorts of other themes, and I really wanted to share that with people, and I wouldn't have written this book if it weren't for that. But excuse me, having written the book, it's given me a real taste for writing, so I've got 1 or 2 other ideas for books lined up, which I'm already working on. But meanwhile, with music, I still play with various people. I've done some recording recently with Mark Armand a little while ago, which I'm very pleased with guitar by Carl Barrett from the Libertines. And I just love playing with the right people anyway, so I'm going to carry on doing that as well.
Okay, great. And what's your favourite piece of Mike's playing?
I think at the moment, and it changes from time to time, it's going to shock all of the hardcore Bowie fans in the room if I actually say that my favourite piece of Mike playing at the moment is not even anything to do with Bowie, at least not directly, and it's the band St. Vincent. And in fact, Annie Clark, you know, asked Mike to play on her album in 2007, which was called Marry Me, and there's one track on that which I would urge, I mean, ideally we'd play it right now, but you know, I think I urge people just to look this up. It's a song called All My Stars Aligned by St. Vincent, and it's absolutely spellbinding, and it's got so much classic Mike Garson piano. As soon as it starts, you'll know it's him. So that's my favourite at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Clifford. I think that concludes my questions. What's next, John?
We're going to have another live performance from the Aladdin Sane album, and it's one of the most theatrical songs on the album. And to sing this, we've got the master of Black Cabaret himself, Mr. Brian Brody. Okay, at this stage, I want to know, is there anyone have any questions from the floor? I'd like to know what they might think of Rick Wakeman's piano playing.
Rick Wakeman played the piano on hunky-dory specifically, and it's great. It's much more of a pop style. You know, it doesn't really have all those jazzy notes that Mike introduced. And for example, Mike introduced what's referred to as a blues note, where you actually do this sort of slide from one note to another, which it's really prevalent in blues and jazz music, probably because it seeks to imitate the human voice slightly more, because whereas with a guitar you can get a lot of feeling in emotionally to imitate the human voice by sliding between the notes. You don't have to play a discrete note one after the other. You can make it a gradual increase in pitch. With a piano, normally you can't do that. Every note is separate, and therefore it can potentially be less emotional in terms of imitating the human voice, whereas what blues and jazz pianists tend to try to do more by... When they do this slide like this over the note, you're trying to find a sound in between the two, which is where the human voice swoops up and down. And so really, once you start bringing in those little jazz and blues cadences, you're getting closer to imitating human emotion.
What did Bowie actually, when he heard the album saying solo for the first time, what was his reaction?
The funny thing was that when he asked Mike to play a jazz solo on that amazing song Aladdin Sane, the title track, Mike started off holding back a bit and just playing some sort of straight jazz, very tame in a way, kind of middle of the road jazz. And David Bowie said, no, that's not why I brought you on board, you know, and I want you to do something different. And Mike then tried a blues thing, and it still wasn't good enough or crazy enough, you know. And apparently David said to Michael, I want you just to do that thing that you do, you know, that, which he means the avant-garde, sort of discordant sound. And Mike said, are you sure? Because if I do, you're not going to sell any of these albums, because he knew it was more obscure. But again, coming back to that point, that David Bowie had the foresight to know that if it was used in the right way, you've got Mike being very discordant on that song, but you've also got the beautifully melodious and harmonious sounds of Mick Ronson's guitar and the saxophone by Ken Fordham and Bowie's vocals. So somehow it works all together.
And in the mid-70s, when Bowie went from Diamond Dogs into Young Americans, he done the Philly Dogs tour. Mike Garson's band actually were the support band as well. Now Bowie's a notorious tight arse with money, paying his band. Was there any, did he double up on his wages, or obviously there was no problem, but was there any stories about that?
Well, it's true. In the long history of Garson's work with Bowie, this was a sort of a high point in terms of the fact that Mike was kind of promoted in 1974 to being the musical director, much as Jerry Leonard was many years later. And on that tour, at the time of the Young Americans was being prepared, the support act was actually called the Garson Band, and featuring various singers, one of whom was later to become a huge star in his own right, which was Luther Vandross. And no, I mean there was a dispute, but it was never with Bowie, but with Tony DeFries, which is that, and I'm not sure this is even in the book because there just wasn't room for all of these things. But you have a lot of these tensions behind the scenes in music tours, obviously, and so basically it was a case that Garson and his band, who were doing the support slot, would not, when they arrived at theatres across the States, there was no billing for them. And I know what this is like. I've had the same thing in certain situations, which will be nameless. But we've all had it, and it was just Tony DeFries making a policy decision of whether it was going to be a draw or not. What would he want to put their name on the front of the theatre and on the bill? And these are the frustrations that Mike and I, ironically, sort of bonded over. Because he said to me that when he came off these tours, he was back to doing some very prosaic work, if you're not really the lead artist, you're going to have to carry on doing some much smaller jobs. And he tells some very funny stories about how, when he was playing in New York, in Madison Square Garden, he was actually asked, what grand piano do you want tonight, the white or the black? And he was just having fun with it. He was joking. He said, I'll have the white tonight and the black tomorrow. And they gave it to him. And then, 3 days later, he remembers clearly being back home, and the first thing that he remembers is his wife saying to him, why the hell haven't you taken the garbage out? And it's like this contrast of life. And also, I mean, we've both done a lot of smaller gigs, and he told me a funny one. Again, I'm not sure if there was even room for it in the book, but he was asked once to go and play in California, where he lives, on a beach. and was offered a lot of money, and was just told, look, this is a very exclusive private party. You come down to the beach, we're having a grand piano on the beach, beautiful white grand piano, and you've got all these seabirds on, Malibu. And he said, fine, I'll do it, And he got there and they were having a barbecue and all the people were standing around. And he said to the guy, but where's the piano? You told me I didn't have to bring my own. And they gestured into the distance. And sure enough, there was a white grand piano on the beach by the water. And it was about half a mile away. And he said it's the strangest thing he's done, but that's where they wanted it. So, the customer is always right.
Did he give you any insights to that Philly Dog tour, because it was so bizarre really, the whole tour, because of the mechanics of it? Obviously the band weren't even seen on stage, and it was all like hydraulics, and Bowie used to come out on the cherry picker and stuff like that. I was just wondering, did he give you any insights into the carnage of that tour?
The mechanics of that tour, yeah, we did go into that, because that tour travelled from the East Coast to the West Coast, as one show, which was called the Diamond Dogs album show, which, as John says, was really overstretched in terms of budget and so on. It was crazy. There was a huge stage set, and it was really Bowie's frustration. He was almost like a frustrated theatrical impresario, and always was in some ways, which is why it's very felicitous that it's just been announced a week or two ago that he's now finally going to be involved in real, not for the first time, but in a real piece of theatre, because he's written a theatrical piece which will be off Broadway starting in November or December, called Lazarus, based on the story of the man who fell to earth. So Bowie right now is actually doing theatre work. That's the interesting part. But back then, as you say, it was overstretched. When they came back from the West Coast to the East Coast, the whole thing was sensibly stripped down. And no, the only problem that I think remains is that a musical one, which is that this was a very different kind of sound that Bowie was exploring. He was experimenting, and it was very much a black musical genre. This was his soul album. This was his soul tour. The opening act with Mike was a sort of a jazz band, and again you had singers like Luther Vandross. And Mike does touch a little bit on the problems of that, because he says some of these audiences, they were there to see Bowie and this is always the way, in his previous guise. And I think Mike even implies, if you read between the lines, that there could have been a bit of racism as well, because some of the crowds in some parts of America, they go to see Bowie and they see a very black band, and there were some really nasty reactions at times, and that is actually touched on in the book as well.
Actually, funny enough, Lazarus, that's it, going to be in New York. He's actually working with Enda Walsh, who's a young playwright from Dublin. So
he's co-written. It's co-written by Enda Walsh, yeah.
I think it's time for another song. Is Dave McGuinness from Lear here?
She'll come, she'll go, she'll lay belief on you, skin sweet with musky oil, lady from another queen soul. Cologne she'll wear, silver and America, she'll drive a beetle car and beat you down at Coolcasta. And when the clothes are strewn, don't be afraid and hate of the room. Touch the fullness of her breast, feel the love of her. She will be your living end. come, she'll go. She lay believe on you, but she won't stake a life on you. How can I become a point of view? And when the clothes are strewn, don't be afraid. Hate of the room, touch the fullness of the breast, feel the love of her caress. She will be your living end. 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 She will be your living
Anyone have any questions?
I have a question. One of the interesting points raised in the book is that Mike never drank, which I found fascinating considering the sort of rock and roll circus he found himself in and the chaos. And he also, you know, had a wife and a child and was very much a family man, and that's very much at odds with the, you know, the lifestyle he was living. Did he speak to you about that outside of what he divulges in the book, or?
He did, very much so, and it was one of the topics that kept coming up. We were both found ourselves quite fascinated by the whole subject of addiction and the question of why so many musicians and other artists seem to fall prey to it, and we ended up going into that in quite some depth, and we have a whole chapter about that sort of thing in the book, which after all is quite a thematic book rather than merely chronological. And it's great, as you say, that he in fact, when you look at the early rock music history of the early 70s, the ironic thing is Mike is one of the few people who took part in that who can remember anything about it, because he was not drinking or taking drugs, and that does genuinely give him a certain clarity of vision about it. But no, he never has, and he finds his sort of meaning to life, for want of a better phrase right now, in the creative process. And you see, he touched on that in that little message we heard earlier, quite discreetly, where, because it really is important to him. And you know, if you pick up on that, he did actually say, didn't he, that he's glad this book has come out because he wants people to, if anything, perhaps take his lead or take his example a little bit. That you can, I think I'm quoting him pretty accurately. He said there, you can make music and make that your life if you want to, without having to be involved in all sorts of crazy dramas.
Yeah, and it also rubbishes the adage of, you know, drugs and drink being the sort of gateway to massive creativity, because he didn't do anything, and he's probably one of the most creative pianists in the rock world. So anyway.
Well, just on that point, it's a fascinating discussion, because there are, you know, it's a complex thing. There are musicians probably here now who will say that they've played better or worse when they have or haven't had a drink and this sort of thing. And it's worth looking at. And Mike's very honest about it. And he actually does, in the book, he talks about some musicians he's worked with who have been heavily involved in drugs. And in one case, the fact that it possibly did superficially seem to improve their playing, and he was like honest enough to actually look at that in a realistic way rather than just see it in black and white. However, I mean, obviously there's a far bigger downside, and somebody who seems to play better as a result of being inebriated, you can almost certainly find an even better way of achieving that level of expression.
In the Ziggy days, do you think that Mike's kind of amazing playing kind of excluded him from wearing the spandex of the Spiders from Mars?
They did try to get him into spandex. One of the people I interviewed for the book was actually Mick Ronson's widow, Susie Ronson, who was very helpful. And she was kind of the band's stylist, basically, in the early 70s. And she, you know, yet another person who sort of remembers Mike very fondly. Yeah, he was a bit odd, according to her and others around. You know, he was certainly eccentric in a different way from the others. One of the themes I found myself exploring in the book was that perhaps the special role that Mike played was kind of an alien amongst aliens, because here he was stepping into what at the time culturally was seen as very cutting edge. You know, here you had men who were sort of semi-transvestite. You had Bowie wearing makeup or whatever and putting his arm around Mick Ronson when they sang Starman on Top of the Pops in 1972. And you've got loads of cultural commentators who talk about whether boundaries were being broken, and that's all very true. Mike was much more straight than that in every sense. But and yet he was an alien in his own way. He was actually, in certain ways, he was even more eccentric, because he was in his own world. And although to outside appearances he looked very sort of straight-laced Mr. 9 to 5, what was going on inside his head certainly was far from mundane. And that's the fascinating thing about it, which is why it was a good choice for Bowie to put him in the middle of that. But Susie told me that she certainly tried to get Mike into spandex, but it wasn't happening.
I'm just wondering, like, when he was sober amongst all that decadence, like, did he ever think, I'm just getting out of here, or, like, you know, he was, what was he thinking, looking upon the band and Bowie gone nuts, basically?
There's one story in the book where he was at an after party in New York during that famous tour, or infamous tour according to some, and he said that he didn't know what he was doing. It just one night in particular, he came to this after party in the hotel in a sort of banqueting hall, and there were rows and rows of people, and they were all snorting lines of cocaine in unison. And he was just walking around, he said, like a zombie. This is what I mean, that in a sense, that drug taking, although it's meant to be the subculture, from his point of view, that was conventionality, and he wasn't part of it. So it's kind of turned it on its head. And the funny thing is, he was suddenly caught, he was suddenly brought to a halt as Bowie shouted out to everyone to stop what they were doing. And Mike had this horrible feeling that it was going to be something to do with him, because he knew he stood out like a sore thumb, and he was terrified that Bowie was going to say, look at this guy, what's he doing here? And to his astonishment and delight, you know, Bowie actually stopped everyone and said, that guy is the only one I respect in this room, because he's not taking drugs. And everyone was like, oh, right, yes, because they obviously had huge respect for Bowie. They had to listen to what he said. He was their boss. Then there was a pause for dramatic effect, and then they all went right back to what they were doing. But Mike remembers that, and I've just given you a little exclusive because we didn't put that in the book. That's a little addendum.
And like you discussed the creative relationship between Mike and Bowie extensively, but like you touched on their personal relationship there. Like Bowie did respect his lifestyle choice. Well, how else? Like obviously they worked together for years. What was their personal relationship like?
It seems to have been very close. They travelled together very often when the band were travelling sort of separately, and they spent a lot of time together. From what I can gather, I would say they spent more time together in the tours of the 70s especially, but also in the 90s and the early 2000s than possibly any other combination. And they did get on. And let's face it, I mean, Bowie, like most of the others, did give up drink and drugs eventually. And I think so in that sense, they've, you know, the rest of them have caught up with Mike.
Yeah, we're going to invite Peter Quinn back up again for a song from Station to Station called Wild is the Wind.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Does, yeah, Clifford's going to do a little reading from the book now.
Brooklyn, New York, one hot autumn night in 1972. A struggling young jazz musician had just completed another small club gig in his hometown. He returned to his wife and baby in their cramped apartment with just a few dollars payment for having worked his usual magic up and down the black and white keys of the piano all night. He was frustrated. The rewards were disproportionate to the effort and creativity he devoted to it. The $5 in his pocket was not enough to feed 3 people until the next gig. There was only one way to play a show. He had to throw his all into it. Whilst playing, he did not care about what he was paid because his was a labour of love. But how could he provide for his family this way? So this time, Mike Garson entered the apartment and announced to his wife, Susan, that he had to find something else to do, something bigger and more lucrative. Of course, he had to continue playing. By now it was second nature to him. But he had to find some way to raise the stakes and the scale of his work. That night they slept fitfully as this grim reality descended on the Garson household. Cut to the Hammersmith Odeon, one of London's largest music venues, less than a year later. David Bowie is performing his last ever concert as his alter ego, Ziggy Stardust. The devoted crowd of nearly 4,000 fans are wild with excitement as they wait impatiently for Bowie to come onto the stage. They are introduced to an unscheduled support act, a lone pianist who will be playing later that night with Bowie and the full band, will appear first. This pianist will not simply keep them entertained with some solo piano, which would be challenging enough, but will play some instrumental piano versions of the very songs which Bowie will later be performing in his set. Mike Garson, for it was he, more than rose to the challenge and was cheered and applauded as he played his instrumental renditions of songs such as Life on Mars, which have since become widely loved classics of modern song. The story of how Mike Garson made the transition from New York jazz pianist to international touring keyboardist with Bowie, and later with rock bands such as Nine Inch Nails and Smashing Pumpkins, is an important piece of modern music history. For this is also the story of how musical boundaries are broken down and how new genres emerge from the flux. In this respect, Garson has been an archetype of the trend towards more fluidity in the creative arts, as he developed virtuoso skills in the broadest possible range of fields, from classical and jazz through avant-garde to rock and pop, and then continued to cross-fertilize and wander across those genres, led only by his passion for the music itself. His fascinating career, to date already spanning 6 decades, is a condensed distillation of many key trends of the era. His triumphant 1973 solo spot on stage for David Bowie in West London came just a few years after Garson had first been called onto a much smaller stage at Greenwich Village's Pookie's Pub by Elvin Jones, renowned drummer with John Coltrane, to replace a pianist who had fallen off the stage, drunk. Garson worked hard at his craft throughout his teens and early 20s, and after that debut with Elvin Jones, had become part of the New York jazz scene. But the work that he has done with Bowie since 1972 began with another extraordinary piece of timing.
I'm just wondering, Cliff, has Garson given any indication that Bowie will ever play live again?
The truth is that he simply doesn't know, as indeed neither does anybody else seem to know apart from Bowie. Really, it's just a guessing game. But what Mike is quite philosophical about is that he's got huge respect for Bowie. He's very, he wasn't called by Bowie to work alongside him for a number of years throughout the 80s. And he just got on with other projects, knowing that if and when that call came again, he'd be ready for it, and it did. And I think it's the same situation now. He's open to anything. He knows he's got a good relationship with Bowie. almost uniquely so actually. And whilst we were working on the, whilst I was engaged in working on the book, which involved actually incredibly intense conversations with Mike, and he was fantastic, by the way. I mean, he made himself available to me 24/7 for the past few years. It was quite extraordinary because he was keen to see this project through to completion. So I was lucky that I've had that incredible cooperation from him, and really got to know him very well indeed. And through that, you know, I'm aware of the fact that there were certain communications between him and David Bowie during this process, some of which I wasn't at liberty to quote or cite in the book, but suffice to say that I can vouch for the fact, definitely, that they have a really strong, positive relationship. And if Mike doesn't appear, as indeed he doesn't actually, on the last couple of albums by David Bowie, that's not for any personal reasons. It's going back to this artistry that Bowie decides what he needs, when he needs it, and Mike's open to that.
And as a pianist, what have you learned from Mike Garson?
Oh, a huge amount, really, both about music and, as I said earlier, about life. This is a guy whose outlook on life has really informed my own in quite subtle ways. I've touched on one or two. This idea about the importance of spontaneity, to the creative process should involve moment by moment sincerity, but you don't express something musically unless you really feel it. And that's why Mike respected the fact that Bowie didn't make records with him if he didn't feel that that would be a correct thing to do. But that can also come across into life, of course. And it's the thing that I like about Mike, to be honest with you, as a person, and I've really got the hold on this over a period of time, is that he's a very rare beast in the fact that he does actually allow those principles of artistic integrity to completely determine his day-to-day life in quite an interesting way.
I'd like to go back to the album where I swapped my six-pack for Hunky Dory and invite Peter Quinn back on stage to sing Life on Mars to finish off this show.
Thank you.
Say thanks to John for having me in tonight and for Clifford, and thanks to you. It's a god-awful small affair to the girl with the mousy hair, and the mommy is yelling no, and her daddy has told her to go, but her friend is nowhere to be seen as she walks through her sunken dream to the sea where the clearest view. Now she's hooked to the silver screen, but the film is a saddening bore, for she's lived it 10 times or more. She could spit in the eyes of fools as they ask her to focus on sailors fighting in the dance halls. Oh man, look at those cavemen go. It's the freakiest show. Take a look at the love man beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, wonder if he'll ever know he's in the best-selling show. Is there life on Mars? It's on America's tortured ground. Mickey Mouse has gone out of town, and the workers have struck for fight, 'cause Lenin's on strike again. See the lights in their million hordes, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Rule Britannia is out of bounds, to my mother, my dog and clowns. But the And look at the low man beating up the wrong guy. Oh man, wonder if you'll ever know. He's in the best-selling show. Is the life on
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Clifford will be signing his book over there. You can ask him any questions. Again, thanks to Music Town for their support. Thanks to Roisin and Dwyer, Joey on sound, Eamon on production, and all the staff here. Most of all, thanks to Clifford.
Thanks very much.